For the first half of the year, life on the estates meant work from dawn to dusk. The Jahajis would head to the sugarcane fields long before sunrise to harvest the crops, while the planters and the rest of the nation were still enjoying their sleep.
It was dawn to dusk during crop season, as it had been for the African. So once the crop season had started, then it would be, you would have to get up at 5 in the morning, start work at 6, and you go to 4 or 5 in the afternoon. So one can say for about the 3 months of the crop season, it was really very difficult, it was very arduous, it was really dawn to dusk.
The women of the estates had multiple responsibilities. In addition to preparing the meals and managing the household, they looked after the children even whilst assisting their husbands in the fields.
When a woman arrived as an adult, she was indentured. So we have to be clear in our minds that women were indentured also. So that an adult woman arriving, and quite a few of them arrived with small children because they had been married in India, she was obliged to work. Her tasks were slightly different from the tasks typically given to men, but the fact is she was expected to turn out every morning, Monday to Friday, and do field labor or other jobs. If she had small children, generally I think on the estates, an older woman looked after the very small children. Children from the age of 6 or 7 were drafted into the labor force. They were not indentured, but they were expected to give labor. They were just paid a few cents for cutting grass and that kind of job, looking after animals. So yes, indeed, she had to juggle, as working women always have had to, multiple responsibilities. She certainly had to do housework and cooking in her barrack room or perhaps the cottage, wherever she lived. She would have to do childcare, and as long as she was indentured, she would be expected to turn out each day to do her task. It's true that on the better managed estates, pregnant women or women nursing babies would not be expected to do a full task every day, but the contract required women as well as men to perform labor.
When she returned, the home chores would begin all over again.
Life as an indentured Indian woman on the plantations was a very hard life. They had to do hard physical labor. Their living conditions were wretched, and they were vulnerable to sexual abuse by plantation staff. And, let us be honest, by Indian men. Because in addition to the overseers, who were generally white, you had the sirdars or drivers, and these were Indian men given positions of authority. And there's pretty good evidence that some of those men also abused the younger women.
During crop over, the immigrants would engage in equipment repair and general off-season maintenance in readiness for the next harvest. For 13 cents per day, some women would plant and salt the canes, while others would weed and dig paragrass in the noonday sun. These simpler post-crop chores would allow them a little more time to practice the agrarian skills they brought, adding to what the Africans had already started centuries before.
They added their own crops such as swamp rice. That is something that they brought, things like guava, new strains of bananas, pomegranates, mango, and then the water buffalo, which they call the pince, the zebu bull, the zebu cow, new varieties of goats, all kinds of vegetables, a whole wide range of different kinds of pulses, different kinds of bhaji, peppers, all kinds of new crops and new animals which changed the whole physical landscape with the cultivation or the rearing of these animals.
But even among the immigrants, life on the sugarcane plantations was not as sweet as many had hoped it would be. There were many anxious moments between the immigrants, between overseer and laborer, and driver and worker. The central source of the discontent originated from a type of control instigated by the planters and perpetrated by the gang leaders. The movement of immigrants was regulated by a system of ordinances that kept them isolated on the plantations. They journeyed from one place to another only through official passes when it was absolutely necessary and at the sole discretion of the overseers. Failure to obey the rules, the immigrants felt the full force of cruel taskmasters, which included swift and brutal punishment that often resulted in pernicious flogging and invariably unnecessary and humiliating incarceration. In this case, punishment was not reserved only for the male, but for the weak and defenseless women of the estates. This type of subjugation often evoked fierce but ineffectual reactions from the men, who felt that they alone had the right to punish their wives and soulmates.
The driver come and hit my mother. When them hit my mother, my father say, "We have no right to hit the wife, because India rule is that." He say, them tell my father, the man and them tell my father. He say, "Look how he hit Bhauji." He say, "Nah, we want to go India again." From Pichimon, them start to come San Fernando. From San Fernando, they watching the sea, very high road to pass, very high road.
Purnima's father's objection is informed by the thesis that flogging and incarceration for minor law-breaking and misdemeanors was not written in his contract. As a consequence, many of the Jahajis believed that they were deceived.
This was never told in the contract. I've seen the contract, the original contracts, that is never mentioned. And while that was the central feature of the indenture system, that if you didn't work or if you had some misdemeanor, and it's a huge variety, about 140 clauses were there, from hospital rules to barrack, how do you keep your barrack house, to how do you work. There were 140 types of breaches. And then you could be in jail. And as you know that amongst the labor, roughly the average rate of incarceration, that means being prosecuted for, was something like 25–30%. So every person in his period of, most probably on an average, every person might be in jail for at least 14 days.
Additionally, overseers would command some women to report to their bungalows for disguised house chores, where they would be abused and violated. In many instances, the overseers would manufacture reasons to imprison some husbands in order to commit their acts of brutality against these innocent women.
The overseers were nearly all young men, unmarried men. Most of them were white. I guess a few were local mixed-race men. And they were in the middle of a population of resident laborers, some indentured, some not. But these were all people who were very much in the power of the estate management. And obviously that was a situation reminiscent of slavery, where the young women were vulnerable to sexual predators among the management staff. So there's no question that this did happen. Now, it was, of course, frowned on by the local government, by the Protector of Immigrants Office, and by the more intelligent managers, because they recognized that perhaps no other issue caused so much discontent and so much rebellion among the estate indentured labor force than interference, as it was politely called, with the Indian women.
The system of recruitment paid lip service to sociological factors, in particular the imbalance of men to women ratio, despite the fact that the authorities had mandated that women constitute 1/3 of every shipload of immigrants coming to the West Indies. The planters were desperate for muscle labor on the plantations. The Arcatias, on the other hand, were only interested in satisfying their depraved lust for wealth. However that was achieved was their major concern.
Obviously, what happens is that if you have a system of labor, you're trying to attract labor. What was required at first was able-bodied labor to work on plantations, and able-bodied labor was generally seen as male labor. So the system started with obviously more men. However, within the plantations and on the estates where many men were housed, there began to be problems of just, I would call it unhappiness of various sorts. You have to remember as well that you are drawing men from India who are young, who within India they would have had their lives arranged. They would have had arranged marriages, they would have had the usual rug of customs around them, and you are now displacing them. And you bring them into a setting in which they are now ill at ease.
Indentureship also created new ways in which Indian women and men viewed each other, away from the protective surveillance of their parents.
You began to have a group of women who are now again displaced from India, in where they also would have had their lives arranged, and where they would have been not in short supply. They are shifted to Trinidad and to the rest of the Caribbean, and they are now in greater demand. So you begin to change the entire system of sexuality, if you like, of the way in which Indian men and women would have related to each other if they were in India, under the eyes of their family.
The indentured female, already in short supply on the plantations, could now bargain with the currency of her sexuality, and this resulted in bitter social problems like domestic violence, wife murders, and suicides.
I think once you disrupt any set of migrants, you begin to create problems. And what became more popular, and what we know more, is the whole notion of wife murders. And men would then maybe maim or kill their wives. But what was not mentioned as much was the amount of men who also committed suicide on doing that. So I think one has to be very careful in looking at the area to see that both men and women suffered. However, it has left a kind of legacy for us of the notion of very violent coolie behavior.
I think a lot of women were routinely beaten, and occasionally these kinds of episodes climaxed in murders of women by their husbands. Usually, of course, the woman was dead, so she couldn't bear testimony, but in the trials that resulted, the argument always was that she had been unfaithful to him, she had left him, and his honor required that he should kill her. And quite a few men were, in fact, convicted and hanged for murdering their wives under these circumstances. And historians are quite sure that this comes out of the special situation, the very distorted living conditions on the plantations. It happened in Guyana, in Mauritius, in Fiji. It was a common pattern where you had the people living together with a skewed sex ratio and under very peculiar living conditions.
Unable to withstand the pains of separation coupled with the rigors of plantation life, many an immigrant male ended up destitute or on the wayside, with the colonial authorities taking no responsibility for these helpless souls. Despite these harrowing experiences, the immigrants survived and prospered through various means, particularly through their religion, during which they recreated village India as perhaps the most strategic form of survival. A strange land, and peoples whose cultural inheritances were different to theirs, but who experienced an historical sameness. The daunting circumstances of a journey they'd never forget, and the trials of a difficult plantation life. The immigrants summoned their survival instincts. On the estates, they maintained a self-inflicted separation from within their own groups and from mainstream Trinidadian society. This perhaps was a hangover from the extremely strong caste system that existed in colonial India. Invariably, tempers would flare and sharp quarrels would develop among the Jahajis. But open hostility towards them from the freed African slaves, coupled with the nakedness of a brusque plantation environment, they were compelled to dismantle whatever social or religious barriers existed among them. Walls broken down and the quest for survival prominent on their agenda, these Jahaji Bhais and Bahins weaned into their small communities a compelling sense of togetherness and cooperation. Cultural practices deemed pagan by the British and considered strange to others who preceded the immigrants made it difficult, almost lawless, to practice their religions and invoke their cultural prowess. They sang their ganas and played their dhuns or music within the confines of their cramped accommodation. In the stillness of night, music from the sitar, sarangi, dholak, dhantal and basuri would fill the air as they petitioned their only links with a distant homeland. Already we've seen parts of that historical journey and the circumstances that led to the arrival of indentured immigrants from India to Trinidad and Tobago. Well, as you know, one of the conditions under which they came was to work for 5 years under a system of paid contract labor, albeit for 24 cents per day, after which they would be given a return passage back home. But that did not go as planned.
The general pattern was that the more the colonial powers understood that the Indians were here to stay, most of them, the less were the incentives to stay. So initially, if you re-indented yourself for an additional period of 5 years, and therefore you saved the British Treasury the expense of having to repatriate you to India, you were given £5 and 5 acres of land. Later on, you could be given £5 and 10 acres of land. After a time, the money incentive was totally removed and you could get 5 acres of land. After a time, the Indian had to contribute to his or her own return to India. So the conditions varied.
Nelson Island is an old fortress replete with various stages of Trinidad's history. The British captured it from the Spaniards in 1797. African slaves constructed its first major building in 1802, and between 1865 to 1917, it was used as a quarantine for the immigrants because the colonial hospital in Port of Spain was complaining that the disease-bearing coolies were occupying crucial bed space at the institution. Across from Nelson is Lenigan Island, which housed a hospital built especially to accommodate disease-bearing immigrants, many of whom died and were cremated here not out of a sense of respect, but because it was impossible to dispose of the dead in the stony grounds. Ironically, cremation of the Indian dead was not permitted in mainland Trinidad until 1946. However, it was here on Nelson Island that the new arrivals bonded and exchanged stories and shared cultural differences. That bond transcended the divisions of caste and religion. On evenings, as the sun began to set, they'd sit under the trees and sing their songs, hoping that the calm waters of the ocean would transmit to their loved ones at home the pains of their loneliness and despair. The small percentages of those eager to return to families in India were quarantined on Nelson Island before repatriation. Invariably, existing conditions in India and the difficulty associated with re-entering Indian society because of the caste system forced many of them to return to Trinidad.
Some of them even came to know that they belonged to the upper caste in the ships, on the ships, or when they landed here. To me, it seems that some of the people who even belong to the upper caste found their conditions helpless in India for one reason or the other. It may be economic, it may be social, and here was an alternative. But we have to keep one thing more in mind. They were going as an indentured labor. They thought that they might return after 5 years. Now, there was a fear of social, you may say, boycott once they return. But more important was survival. Once they could survive for 5 years, once they could live outside their own society, that was also an important issue at that time.
Between 1869 to 1880, many ex-indentured immigrants benefited from a short-lived land commutation scheme.
During that short period, quite a lot of ex-indentured immigrants got grants of 5 or perhaps in a few cases 10 acres of crown lands in lieu of commutation. That meant they had to sign a little piece of paper saying they gave up their rights of repatriation. So a relatively small number of ex-indentured Indians were granted free grants of crown land. The acreage was, I believe, about 19,000 acres. Much of the land was pretty bad land. It was marginal or difficult to cultivate. The great majority of ex-indentured Indians who acquired land did so not through free grants but through